Hey, deep divers, ready to tackle a big one.
Always up for a challenge.
Today we're diving into culture and democracy.
Oh, classic.
Yeah, does culture make it easier or harder to become and stay democratic?
A question for the ages.
We've got some fascinating sources to untangle this.
Nice.
A political science textbook, of course.
Makes sense.
But also, get this, research on global games.
Oh, that's interesting. How so?
We'll get there, but there's more.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
We're even going to peek into the Constitution of Medina.
Wow, covering all the bases.
And get this, get ready for some myth-busting along the way.
Sounds like fun.
The usual suspects when it comes to culture and democracy, they might not be who you think.
Okay, you got my attention. Let's dive in.
So first things first, how much does culture really matter for democracy?
Right, well, there are two main views on this.
Lay it on me.
You've got the primordialists. They think culture is fixed, like inherited.
Okay, so if your ancestors weren't democratic, you're out of luck.
Basically, yeah, they see it as deep-rooted and unchanging.
Interesting.
Then there are the constructivists.
Okay, what do they say?
They see culture as more malleable, like it's invented and can change.
So more adaptable.
Exactly, like think bloodlines versus invented traditions.
Got it. So not set in stone.
Right. And for this deep dive, we're focusing on that constructivist view.
Makes sense. So we're not assuming anything's predetermined.
Exactly.
No, we can't talk about culture and democracy without mentioning some big names.
Oh, you mean like Montesquieu and John Stuart Mill?
The OG thinkers on this topic.
They were really ahead of their time grappling with this connection.
Yeah, Montesquieu had that idea about matching government to a country's humor.
Right, like a country's temperament.
And Mill believed people could learn to be good Democrats.
Yeah, through education and experience.
But, and maybe this is just me, but those ideas seem so broad.
That's a common critique for sure.
Like, how do you even measure a country's humor?
Exactly. It's tough to test those ideas rigorously.
So, groundbreaking for their time, but maybe a bit lacking in evidence.
You could say that their arguments needed more concrete support.
Okay, so how do we move from those big philosophical ideas to something more testable?
That's where the concept of civic culture comes in.
Okay, I've heard of that, but remind me.
It was popularized by Almond and Verba in their book, The Civic Culture.
Right.
They argued that certain cultural traits are crucial for democracy to thrive.
So specific things, not just vague ideas.
Exactly. Things you can actually measure and study.
Like what?
High interpersonal trust, for one.
Meaning people generally trust each other.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Also, a preference for gradual change over revolutions.
So stability over upheaval.
Right, and a belief that individuals can actually influence political decisions.
So people feel like their voices matter.
Exactly, that's the core of civic culture.
Makes sense.
Oh, and here's a fun fact.
I love fun facts.
Almond and Verba thought the U.S. and U.K. were the closest to this ideal civic culture.
Back in their day, right?
Yeah, in the 1960s.
Makes you wonder if that still holds true today.
Things have definitely changed, haven't they?
Now, here's another big question. Does development create culture, or is it the other way around?
The chicken and egg problem.
Exactly. Which one comes first?
There's the value story, which says economic development leads to cultural shifts.
So as countries get richer, their values change.
Right, things like individual rights and tolerance become more important.
And those values then make democracy more likely.
Exactly. That's the argument.
Interesting, but couldn't it also be that democracy itself shapes culture?
Absolutely. That's the other side of the coin, the institutional story.
So experiencing democracy makes people more trusting or pro-gradual change.
Exactly. The institutions themselves can nurture a democratic culture.
So which is it? Culture shaping democracy or the other way around?
A tough nut to crack.
Well, we did some digging to see if we could shed some light on this.
Oh. What did you find?
We reanalyzed data from the World Value Survey. It's from the University of Michigan.
Solid source.
Yeah, and we focused on whether having a certain religious majority in a country matters.
Like Catholic, Protestant, or Muslim?
You got it. Does it affect their chances of becoming and staying democratic?
Fascinating question.
But before we jump into the findings, a quick caveat.
Always good to be cautious.
Surveys are good for spotting trends, but they can't prove cause and effect.
Correlation doesn't equal causation.
Exactly. Just because two things are related doesn't mean one causes the other.
Okay, fair enough. So what did your analysis reveal?
Well, let's just say it challenges some common assumptions.
Okay, now you've really got me curious.
Especially when it comes to Islam and democracy.
Yeah, that's a topic where people have strong opinions.
To say the least, many believe Islam is just inherently incompatible with democracy.
Right, that argument has been around for a while.
It goes way back, even Montesquieu thought so.
But it often relies on selective evidence.
Cherry picking, as they say.
Exactly, ignoring the diversity within the Muslim world.
Okay, but what about the lack of democracies in many Muslim-majority countries?
That's where things get interesting. Our analysis found something surprising.
Get me with it.
When you factor in a country's wealth, Muslim-majority countries are not inherently less likely to democratize.
So it's not Islam itself, but maybe other factors.
Exactly. It seems poverty is a bigger obstacle.
So correlation, not causation.
Precisely. We can't say Islam prevents democracy, but the context matters.
Really makes you think twice about those simplistic narratives.
Nuance is key.
Okay, so what about those other religions? What did you find about Protestant and Catholic countries?
Well, buckle up. The results are fascinating.
I'm ready.
Protestant majority countries, they weren't necessarily more likely to become democracies.
Okay, interesting.
But once they did, they were incredibly stable.
Really?
No Protestant democracy in our data set ever collapsed.
Wow, talk about staying power.
Right. It raises questions about what contributes to that stability.
Is there something about Protestant culture itself?
Or maybe the historical context in which democracy emerged in those countries.
It's a puzzle for sure.
Now, Catholic countries, that's where things get really intriguing.
Okay, I'm all ears.
They were actually more likely to transition to democracy than others.
Really? That's surprising given the historical view of Catholicism and democracy.
Right. You'd think it'd be the opposite.
But then they struggle to stay democratic.
Yeah, kind of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back situation.
So they become democratic more often, but also backslide more.
Exactly. This fragile democratization process.
What could explain that?
It's complex, could be historical power dynamics between the church and political authorities.
Or maybe certain social and cultural norms that make it tough to sustain democracy.
Could be a mix of factors. Definitely needs more research.
But it definitely challenges those simple narratives about religion and democracy.
Absolutely. It's way more nuanced than that.
Now, speaking of nuance, we also looked at diversity within countries.
Oh, how does that play into democratization?
Right, we had 2 main questions in mind.
I'm listening.
First, does diversity make it harder to become democratic in the first place?
Makes sense. There's that idea that shared culture helps democracy.
Exactly. So does diversity make it harder to get there?
And second, does diversity make existing democracies less stable?
Right. Does it make them more fragile?
So what did you find?
Well, the results might surprise you.
I'm all for surprises.
We found no evidence that ethnic, religious, or cultural diversity hinders democratization.
So diverse countries can become democratic just as easily.
Seems that way. Diversity doesn't seem to destabilize dictatorships or prevent transitions.
Interesting.
However, we did find some evidence that diversity can make it harder for democracies to survive.
So getting there is fine, but staying democratic is tougher.
That's one interpretation. Diversity might pose challenges for maintaining democracy.
That makes you think.
It suggests diversity can be a strength, but it also needs careful attention.
To build a cohesive society that values pluralism.
Exactly, and respects differences.
Makes me think about those game theory experiments we mentioned.
Oh, how so?
Maybe cultures with systems for cooperating across diverse groups are better at democracy.
Like they've already got the games for managing differences.
Exactly. Maybe those societies have figured out how to make it work.
That's a fascinating connection, for sure.
It is.
But before we dive deeper into that, let's shift gears and explore those game theory experiments in more detail.
Sounds good. I'm ready for some game theory fun.
Get ready to have your mind blown. They offer a whole new way of thinking about culture and democracy.
I'm intrigued. Let's go.
Welcome back, deep divers.
Ready for round 2.
You bet. Remember those game theory experiments we mentioned?
Oh yeah, the ones that blew your mind.
They're back and ready to shake up our understanding of culture and democracy.
It's a whole new way of looking at how culture shapes our choices.
And how those choices play out in the political arena.
Exactly. It's like everyday life is full of these little games.
Games. Okay, I'm intrigued, but you've got to break this down for me.
Think about it. Every interaction has rules, strategies, winners, and losers.
Okay, I see where you're going.
And how different cultures approach these games can tell us a lot about their values.
And how those values might translate to democracy.
You got it. So let's start with a classic, the ultimatum game.
Lay it on me.
Imagine you and I have to split $10.
Sounds good to me so far.
I get to decide how to divide the money.
All right, I'm listening.
But you have the power to accept or reject my offer.
Okay, getting interesting.
Here's a catch. If you reject my offer, neither of us gets anything.
Ooh, high stakes.
So what would you do?
If I were playing, I'd probably offer you like $1, hoping you'd take it rather than nothing.
That's what traditional economic theory would predict.
The whole people are selfish idea.
Yeah, the Homo economicus model, always maximizing their own gains.
But real people don't always play like that, right?
That's the fascinating part. Culture throws a wrench in those predictions.
Okay, tell me more.
Researchers have done this game worldwide, and the results are surprising.
How so?
People routinely offer more than the bare minimum,
Really?
and they often reject unfair offers, even if it means losing money.
So it's not just about cold, hard logic.
Nope. Culture shapes our ideas of fairness and what we're willing to accept.
That makes sense. We're not just robots.
We care about things like reciprocity and maintaining good relationships.
Okay, so how does this connect to democracy?
Well, democracy needs cooperation, compromise, trust.
People working together, even when they disagree.
Exactly. So a culture's game can influence how well they do that.
So if a culture is super competitive, winner take all, that might be a problem for democracy.
Could be, yeah.
But other cultures might have games that emphasize collective decision-making.
A respect for elders, or a strong sense of community responsibility.
And those values could make democracy easier.
Potentially. Yeah, it's all about those underlying values.
Okay, this is all pretty theoretical. Did researchers actually study these games in different cultures?
Absolutely. There's this amazing study where scientists went to 15 small-scale societies.
Wow, 15. That's a lot.
All over the world, from foragers to whale hunters.
Talk about diversity. They must have seen some wild stuff.
Oh, they did. For example, the O and Now people in Papua New Guinea.
What about them?
They'd make incredibly generous offers in the Ultimatum game.
Really? That's unexpected.
But then, get this, they'd get offended if the other person accepted.
Wait, what? Why would they do that?
Their culture is all about gift-giving and reciprocity.
So a big offer wasn't generosity.
No, it was seen as creating an imbalance, a debt that's hard to repay.
That's fascinating. Like, their culture had a built-in mechanism for equality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you have the Machigenga of Peru, the opposite.
How so?
They live in small family groups, rarely cooperate with outsiders.
Sounds isolated.
Very much so. And their offers in the game were super low.
No surprise there.
It reflected their worldview, self-reliance, family over community.
Totally different game than the O and Now.
Right. Highlighting how culture shapes our assumptions about how the world works.
I'm starting to see the connection to democracy more clearly now.
It's about understanding those unwritten rules each culture have.
Their own way of playing the game of life.
Exactly. And those rules can either help or hinder democratic values.
Okay, so culture matters, but it's not destiny.
Right. It's not set in stone.
But that makes me wonder, can we actively change those cultural games to be more democratic?
Now, that's the million-dollar question.
Can we intentionally shift those values?
It's a tough one. But to explore it, we need to talk about institutions.
Okay, institutions, how do they fit in?
Think of it this way. Institutions are like the rules of the game.
So if we change the rules, maybe we can change the way people play.
Exactly. That's the idea.
I like where this is going.
But before we get into that, let's circle back to religion and democracy.
Right, we can't leave those surprising findings hanging.
There's still a lot to unpack about how religion, culture, and democracy all intertwine.
Back again for more deep diving.
Always a pleasure to dive deep.
We've been on quite a journey exploring culture and democracy.
And it's more complex than meets the eye, isn't it?
It really is. Religion isn't always the deciding factor. Game theory shows us hidden values.
And those values might even predict how democratic a country can become.
Exactly. And we've learned that culture isn't some fixed thing.
Right. It's dynamic. It adapts.
Constantly evolving.
Like a river, always changing, shaping the landscape around it.
Love that analogy. It captures how culture and institutions interact.
They influence each other over time. It's a two-way street.
So about those institutions, if culture can shape democracy, can we also shape culture to make societies more democratic?
That's the big question. Can we engineer a more democratic culture?
Is it even possible?
Well, there's no easy answer. But our sources suggest institutions can play a role.
So it's not about changing people's beliefs overnight.
Right. It's about creating systems that encourage democratic behavior.
So design systems that reward those actions.
Exactly. Think back to those game theory experiments.
The ultimatum game and all that?
Yeah. They showed how cultural norms shape our interactions.
Right.
So what if we designed institutions that promote cooperation?
The kind of behaviors that are essential for democracy.
Exactly. Instead of focusing only on elections and constitutions.
We need to think about the everyday interactions, the games people play.
And create systems that incentivize fairness, compromise, shared responsibility.
It's like changing the rules of the game to reward collaboration.
And discourage those winner-take-all mentalities.
Makes sense, but let's be real, changing institutions is hard.
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge undertaking.
And even with the perfect system, there's no guarantee you'll change culture instantly.
Cultural change is a slow process. It takes time.
But it can happen, right?
We've seen it happen. Think about gender equality or environmentalism.
Those attitudes have shifted drastically in many countries.
Right. But it took decades of effort.
Activists, educators, policymakers, everyday citizens pushing for change.
It shows the power of education, public discourse, open dialogue.
So, no magic formula, but we can nudge cultures in a more democratic direction.
By creating the right incentives, fostering open dialogue, empowering citizens.
It's about giving people the tools to shape their own societies.
Exactly, and it's a constant process, building and sustaining democracy.
Requires attention, adaptation, learning from our mistakes.
Well said, it's an ongoing journey.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener.
Glad to hear it.
We learned so much about the complex dance between culture and democracy.
Challenged some assumptions, explored fascinating research.
And hopefully sparked some new ideas about building a more democratic future.
That's the goal, isn't it?
Absolutely. And remember, this isn't just theory, it's about understanding ourselves.
Our communities, the world around us.
So keep asking questions, keep learning, keep making a difference.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another adventure into the world of ideas.
Until then, keep exploring.